The cold had teeth that night. It bit through the thin wool of Josie's cloak, found the spaces between her fingers, climbed the back of her neck where her dark hair had come loose from its braid. She stood at the edge of the great hall's entrance, not inside it, never inside it, holding a clay jug of mulled wine that had long gone lukewarm in her grip. She was not supposed to be here. Not at the celebration. Not near the high tables where lords and their chosen sat on carved oak chairs with goblets of silver and laughter that carried like smoke through the stone corridors. She was here because Marta, the head servant, had twisted her ankle on the cellar stairs, and someone had to carry the wine. And Josie was always the someone when no one else wanted to be. She had grown used to being that someone. 23 years of life in the pack settlement of Dunver, and she had learned her place the way one learns the shape of a scar. Not by looking at it, but by the way it ached in cold weather. Omega. Unmatched. Unwanted. 3 men had stood before her in the bonding ceremonies of the past 5 years. 3 men chosen by their families, by the elders, by the faint hope that perhaps this time the bond would take. 3 men who had looked at her, breathed in her scent, and turned away without a word. No anger, no cruelty, just nothing. The absence of recognition, the quiet devastation of being looked through like fog. The 3rd rejection had been 6 months ago. She had not cried. She had gone back to the kitchens and scrubbed the iron pots until her hands were raw, and she had not cried. She shifted the jug to her other arm and exhaled. Her breath made a small ghost in the cold air. Inside the hall, the celebration for the AlphaKing's arrival burned bright. Torches lined the walls in iron brackets, casting orange warmth over faces flushed with wine and nerves. The lords of Dunvar had spent a fortnight preparing for this visit. Fresh rushes on the floor, the good linen on the high table, venison and roasted pheasant, and 3 kinds of bread. The AlphaKing did not visit small pack settlements often. When he did, everything changed. Josie had seen him ride in that afternoon. She had not meant to look. She had been crossing the yard with a basket of linens, and the procession had passed through the main gate. A column of riders in black cloaks with the silver wolf sigil at their shoulders, horses the color of midnight, breath streaming from their nostrils in the autumn air. And at the front, on a horse so dark it seemed to absorb the pale sunlight rather than reflect it, rode Adrian Voss, the AlphaKing of Varenhold. She had not expected him to look like that. She had heard stories, distant, exaggerated things whispered by serving girls and old men near fires, that he was ruthless, that he had ended 3 wars before turning 30, that no one met his eyes directly and walked away unchanged. She had imagined someone cold and carved from stone, something more symbol than man. But when he rode through the gate, he looked tired. Not weak, not diminished. Tired in the way that mountains look tired, like something that has borne enormous weight for a very long time without complaint. His jaw was set, his dark eyes scanning the yard with a practiced calm, his broad shoulders straight beneath the black cloak lined in charcoal fur. He was perhaps 32, perhaps older. It was difficult to tell with alphas of his bloodline. He wore no crown. He did not need one. Josie had looked away quickly. It was not wise to stare. Now, standing at the threshold of the hall with her cooling jug of wine, she heard Lord Aldrich Fenn's voice rising above the music. Something obsequious and eager about the honor of hosting His Majesty, about the loyalty of Dunver, about his eldest daughter Cressida, who was already positioned near the high table in a green gown embroidered with gold thread, her pale hair braided with tiny amber beads. Cressida Fenn was everything Josie was not. Chosen, desired, the daughter of a lord, with a scent the male wolves turned toward like flowers toward light. She had never been rejected. She likely could not imagine what it felt like. Josie told herself it did not sting. She told herself this several times. She took a breath, squared her shoulders, and slipped through the side entrance of the hall toward the servants' passage along the wall. She would refill the Lord's goblets, keep her eyes down, and disappear before anyone remembered she existed. She had taken perhaps 4 steps along the wall when someone moved into her path. She stopped so abruptly that wine sloshed over the rim of the jug and splashed the stone floor, and her boot, and the boot of the person standing directly before her. Josie's eyes went up slowly, the way they do when some part of you already knows what you're going to find and is trying to delay it. Adrian Voss stood in the shadow of a stone pillar, apart from the noise and the light of the high table, alone in a way that seemed deliberate. He had stepped away from the celebration. Or perhaps he had never fully been part of it. His black cloak was pushed back from his shoulders. One hand rested against the pillar. He was looking down at the wine now spreading across the stone between their feet, with an expression she could not read. Josie's heart lurched sideways in her chest. She dropped into a bow immediately, nearly spilling the rest of the jug. "Your Majesty, forgive me. I did not see. Be still." His voice was low, not a shout, not even raised, but it filled the space the way thunder fills a valley, completely, without effort, without apology. She stilled. A long moment passed. She could feel the warmth radiating from him even at this distance, which made no sense because the hall was cold and he was standing in shadow. Her pulse beat in her ears. "Look at me," he said. She looked up. His dark eyes were already on her, not past her, not through her, on her, with a directness that made her feel briefly like something real and particular, like a person with edges and weight and a name. It was so unfamiliar that it almost hurt. He studied her face for a moment that stretched too long for comfort. Then he asked her something no one had asked her in years. No lord, no elder, no man at any bonding ceremony. No one in the kitchens or the yard or the cold corridors of Dunvare had thought to ask it. "Are you all right?" he said. Josie stared at him. The question made no sense. She was a servant with a jug of wine. She had just spilled it on the floor, on his boot. She was Omega. She was the girl who had been rejected 3 times, the girl no one chose. The girl who was always the someone because she was no one's anyone. She was in trouble, probably, for being in his path. She was not, by any reasonable measure, the kind of person an AlphaKing asked after. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "Yes, Your Majesty." He looked at her a moment longer. Something moved behind his eyes. Something she did not have a name for. Something that looked almost like recognition, which was impossible because they had never met. "You're lying," he said quietly. And then, before she could find a single word to answer that, Lord Aldrich Fenn appeared at his elbow with a wide smile and a fresh goblet, pulling Adrian Voss back toward the brightness of the high table and away from the shadow and the spilled wine, and Josie, who stood alone in the dark corridor with a half-empty jug and a heart doing something very strange inside her chest. She did not move for a long moment. The music played on. Cressida Fenn laughed at something near the high table. Torchlight flickered, and Josie thought, he knew. He had looked at her for perhaps 30 seconds in a dim corridor, and he had known she was not all right. In 5 years of bonding ceremonies and a lifetime of Dunvare, not one person had thought to look long enough to notice. She turned and walked back toward the servants' passage. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was careful. But something, small and fragile and dangerous, had cracked open inside her, right there beside the spilled wine on the cold stone floor. And she did not know yet what it was going to become. Morning came gray and indifferent to Dunvar. Josie was already in the kitchens before the first light touched the narrow windows, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, her dark hair pulled back under a linen cloth. The fire in the great hearth had been rebuilt from last night's coals, and the smell of wood smoke and salted pork filled the low-ceilinged room with a warmth that almost convinced her the world outside was not bitter cold. She focused on the bread. Flour, water, the firm press of her palms against dough that pushed back. There was comfort in the resistance of it, in the simple fact that this at least responded to her in a predictable way. She had slept poorly, not because of the cold, though her pallet near the kitchen stores was drafty and thin, not because of the noise from the great hall, which had gone on until well past midnight, but because every time she had closed her eyes, she had seen dark eyes in a stone corridor and heard a question asked in a voice low enough to be private. "Are you all right?" She pressed the heels of her hands into the dough and exhaled. It meant nothing. He had likely spoken to a dozen people last night. He was a king, an Alpha King, and kings said things, polite things, careful things designed to make those beneath them feel momentarily seen without actually being seen. She had heard Lord Aldrich do it constantly, that particular art of performed attention. She told herself this firmly, and did not quite believe it. "You're doing that too hard," said a voice behind her. Josie turned. Nell was watching her from the doorway with a bucket of water in each hand, and the expression of someone who has seen too much of life to be surprised by any of it. Nell was 60, perhaps older, with white hair braided close to her head and hands that were permanently stained from years of herbs and dyes and honest work. She had been in Dunvare's kitchens since before Josie was born, and she was the closest thing Josie had to someone who claimed her. "The bread will be dense if you work it like it owes you something," Nell said, setting the buckets down. "It might," Josie said. Nell made a sound that was not quite a laugh. She crossed to the fire and hung one of the buckets over it, then turned and looked at Josie with the particular attention of someone who notices things and files them away without comment, until they choose to comment. "You were near the high passage last night," Nell said. It was not a question. "Marta's ankle. I know about Marta's ankle." Nell wiped her hands on her apron. "I'm talking about what happened after." Josie returned to her bread. Nothing happened. "Lord Aldrich's steward says the Alpha King stood in the side corridor for nearly 10 minutes before you came through with the wine. He doesn't usually separate himself from a gathering like that." A pause. "And then you came through and he spoke to you." "He spoke at me," Josie corrected. "It was nothing." Nell was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled. Somewhere above them, the castle was beginning to stir. The shuffle of boots on stone, the distant clang of the guard's morning change. "He asked about you this morning," Nell said. Josie's hand stopped. "Not by name," Nell continued, watching her carefully. "He asked Lord Aldrich who the serving girl was that carried wine through the side passage. Lord Aldrich didn't know. He had to ask his steward." Josie stared at the dough. "Aldrich will have told him I'm Omega," she said. Her voice came out flat, unmatched. "He was probably just curious about the disruption. I spilled wine on his boot." Said Nell, in the tone that meant she had formed an opinion and was choosing not to share it yet. Josie shaped the loaves in silence, pressing the dough into the clay molds with more attention than they required. Her thoughts were moving in directions she did not trust, toward things that felt too much like hope, and hope had always been expensive for her. She had learned to spend it carefully. The morning passed. Josie carried bread to the hall. She swept the corridor near the east wing, where the Alpha King's personal guard had been quartered. She kept her eyes on the floor as she had always done, her movements small and efficient, the kind of presence that slides through rooms without disturbing anything. It was in the east corridor, past the second iron sconce, that she heard them. 2 of Lord Aldrich's men, senior betas, both of them, the kind who stood near important people and absorbed reflected importance. She recognized their voices before she saw them. Colt Renner, Aldrich's head guard, and his second, a broad man named Piers, who smelled of horse leather and old ambition. She had almost passed the corner when she heard her own name. "Josie? The Omega girl?" Piers was saying. "That's the one he asked about." Aldrich confirmed it. Colt's voice was lower, careful. 3 failed bondings. No one's claimed her. She's been in the kitchen since she was a girl. Nobody. A short silence. Then Piers made a sound, dismissive, somewhere between a laugh and a scoff. He must have been tired, or bored, or both. Either way, Colt said. Aldrich's not going to let it go anywhere. He has Cressida positioned. The alliance with the Eastern Lords depends on the king showing interest in a high-born female from this settlement. The last thing he needs is the king distracted by a rejected Omega who has no family, no standing, nothing, Piers agreed. Nothing, Colt confirmed. Their footsteps receded down the corridor. Josie stood still against the cold stone wall, the broom in her hands, the words settling over her like the first snow of winter, quiet, thorough, covering everything. Nothing. She had known that word her whole life. She had worn it so long it had almost become comfortable. But hearing it spoken in that particular tone, calculated, indifferent, the way men speak of inconveniences to be managed rather than people to be considered, made something tighten in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite anger, but lived in the narrow space between them. She returned to work. She always returned to work. By midday, the Alpha King's party had gathered in the outer yard for a brief council with Lord Aldrich and his senior men. Josie was not meant to be there. She was crossing the yard with a message for the stablemaster about hay for the king's horses, when she walked directly into the edge of the gathering and stopped. The men were arranged in a loose half-circle, Aldrich at the center, his senior betas flanking him, 3 of Adrian Voss's own guard on the opposite side, and Adrian himself stood with his back to the wind, a fur-lined riding cloak around his shoulders, a parchment map unfurled in his hands. He was speaking in a low, measured tone about something to do with the northern passes and the movement of supply routes. His attention was on the map. His commanders listened with the focused stillness of men who had learned to absorb information quickly. Josie tried to back away without being noticed. She was not quick enough. He looked up. Not slowly. Not the casual survey of a man glancing around. But directly. As though he had known she was there before he looked. His dark eyes found her immediately across the yard. And for one strange, suspended moment, the world between them seemed to go quiet. Then one of his men, a lean, sharp-eyed man with a captain's braid at his shoulder, followed the king's gaze and found Josie standing at the yard's edge, with a message she was clearly not delivering. The captain's expression shifted into something cool and evaluating. Josie turned and walked. Quickly. Not quite running. Behind her, she heard the Alpha King's voice resume, even and unhurried, returning to the northern passes and the supply routes as though nothing had occurred. But she had seen what was in his eyes in that moment before he looked away. Not curiosity, not boredom, not the blank assessment of a king cataloging his subjects. Something she had absolutely no framework for. Something that looked, impossibly, like he had been waiting. That evening, Nell found Josie in the root cellar, sorting through winter stores by the light of a single tallow candle, and set a folded piece of parchment on the crate beside her without a word. Josie looked at it. It was sealed with black wax, pressed with the silver wolf of Varenhold. Her hands went still. "It came through his steward," Nell said quietly. "Addressed by description, not by name. Because Lord Aldrich's people apparently couldn't remember your name when asked." Her voice held something dry and sad at once. Josie picked up the parchment. The wax seal was unbroken. "Are you going to open it?" Nell asked. Josie thought about Colt Renner's voice in the corridor that morning. Nothing. She thought about 3 men turning away from her in bonding circles. She thought about hope, and what it cost, and how poorly she could afford it. She broke the seal. Inside, in a plain, direct hand that did not look like it had been written by a scribe, were 7 words. "Meet me at the East Gate." Dawn. No signature, No title, no explanation. Just 7 words, and a black wax wolf, and the faint smell of wood smoke and pine resin still caught in the folds of the parchment. Josie sat in the cellar for a long time with the candle burning low beside her. Then she folded the parchment carefully, tucked it inside her apron, and went back to sorting the winter stores. She did not sleep at all. Dawn came like a held breath. The sky above Dunver was the deep, uncertain blue that exists only in the minutes before light fully commits to the world. Not dark, not bright, but suspended somewhere between the two, as though morning itself was waiting to see what would happen first. Josie stood at the east gate. She had not decided to come. Or rather, she had decided a dozen times not to come, and then had found herself pulling on her second cloak in the dark of the kitchen stores, the heavier one with the patched lining, and lacing her boots with hands that were steadier than she expected. She had walked the east corridor without a candle because she knew its stones by feel. Every uneven seam, every place where the draft came through the wall. She had lifted the gate's iron latch with both hands because it was heavy and cold, and no one had oiled it in years. She did not know why she had come. That was not entirely true. She knew exactly why she had come. She simply did not trust the knowing. The east gate opened onto a narrow path that ran along the outer wall of Dunver's settlement, past a stand of old pines that leaned together like men sharing a secret, and down toward the frost-covered field that separated the settlement from the tree line. In the gray pre-dawn, the field looked like hammered pewter. The air smelled of cold earth and pine resin, and the faint, particular stillness that belongs to places before the day's noise fills them. She waited. She was good at waiting. It was one of the things she had learned to do well. He came from the direction of the pines, alone, which surprised her. Wearing a plain dark riding cloak with no sigil, no silver wolf, nothing to mark him as anything other than a man who rose early. His breath made small clouds in the cold air. He walked without hurry, without the deliberate display of authority she had seen in the yard the day before, and when he stopped a few feet from her, he looked at her the same way he had in the corridor the first night. Like she was real, like she was particular. "You came," he said. "I considered not coming," she said honestly, because at the east gate at dawn with frost on her boots, she found she did not have the energy for a more careful answer. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. That's fair. A silence. The pines shifted in a small wind. Somewhere inside the settlement, a cock crowed, distant and muffled. "You don't know who I am," he said. It was not a question. "I know who you are," Josie said. "You're the AlphaKing of Varenhold. You've held the northern border since the Ashfall War. You have 3 generals who've never lost a campaign, and a steward who apparently cannot remember the names of serving girls." He looked at her steadily. "I meant, you don't know me, not the stories, the person." She considered this. "No," she agreed. "I don't." "Good," he said quietly. "The stories are mostly wrong." He turned and began walking along the path beside the wall, slow enough that it was clearly an invitation. Josie hesitated for exactly 1 breath, then fell into step beside him. Not behind him, beside him. She noticed he had positioned himself on the outer side of the path, between her and the open field, an old instinctive thing that she doubted he was even conscious of. "Lord Aldrich told me about you," Adrian said. She kept her eyes forward. "I imagine he did. He told me you were Omega, that you'd been through 3 bonding ceremonies without a match." A pause. He said it as though it explained something, as though it was sufficient information. "Most people find it sufficient," Josie said. "What did you find it?" The question landed differently than she expected. She turned to look at him briefly. He was watching the tree line, his jaw set, his expression unreadable in the pale light. "Exhausting," she said finally. found it exhausting." He nodded once, slowly, as if she had confirmed something he had already suspected. They walked in silence for a moment. The frost crunched quietly under their boots. Above the tree line, the sky was beginning to lighten at its edges, the blue thinning toward silver. "Why did you ask to meet me?" Josie said. The question had been sitting in her chest since the cellar, growing heavier. "You're here for Lord Aldrich's counsel. You have Cressida Fenn positioned at your table, and an alliance that apparently depends on your interest in her. I'm a serving girl who spilled wine on your boot. There is no reasonable explanation for this." He stopped walking. She stopped too, and turned to face him, and found that he was looking at her with an expression that was not the careful blankness of a man managing a situation, but something rawer and more uncertain, something that sat strangely on a face built for command. "When you walked through that corridor," he said, "you were carrying that jug as though it weighed more than it did, not from the weight of the clay." He paused. "I know what it looks like when someone is carrying something that isn't physical. I've been carrying something similar long enough to recognize it in other people." Josie said nothing. Her throat felt tight. "I asked Lord Aldrich about you. He gave me a list of facts that told me nothing about you." His voice was even, but underneath it something moved, something careful and honest in a way that felt costly. "So I thought I would ask you instead." "Ask me what?" He looked at her directly. "What you want, not what the bonding ceremonies want, not what Dunver expects from an Omega. What you want." The question fell into the silence of the early morning and kept falling, the way a stone falls through deep water, taking much longer to reach the bottom than you expect. No one had ever asked her that. In 23 years, with 3 men who had turned away and a lifetime of kitchens and cold corridors, and being the someone when no one else wanted to be. No one had ever stood in front of her at dawn and asked what she wanted. She felt the back of her eyes sting and blinked it away hard. "I want to matter," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it did not shake. "Not to everyone. Not to a court or a council. I want to matter to someone. Specifically. On purpose. Not because I'm useful or convenient, but because I'm Josie. Because there's something in particular about me that is worth choosing." She stopped, drew a breath. "That's what I want." The wind moved through the pines. A single bird called from somewhere in the trees, once, clear and high. Adrian Voss looked at her with those dark, tired eyes, and something in his expression shifted. Not dramatically, not with the grand gesture of a man performing emotion, but quietly, the way ice shifts when the temperature changes by 1 degree. Almost imperceptible. Entirely real. "That's not a small thing to want," he said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." They walked back toward the gate separately, because they were not yet the kind of people who walked back together from things. But at the gate, before she lifted the iron latch, he said her name for the first time, Josie. And she turned and he said, "Come to the hall tonight, not as a servant, as a guest." She stared at him. "Lord Aldrich will object," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "Cressida Fenn will be furious. Probably. It will cause talk. Among the guards, the servants, everyone. It will," he said evenly. She waited for the qualifier. For the but that would pull the invitation back into something manageable and safe, something that would not disturb Aldrich's careful arrangements, and the alliance, and the amber-beaded girl in the green gown. It did not come. "Why?" she said. He held her gaze. "Because I want you in the room." He paused. "Specifically. On purpose." Her own words. Returned to her, used with precision, without apology. Josie pulled the latch. The gate swung open on its cold hinges. She stepped through. "I'll think about it," she said. She heard something behind her that might have been the beginning of a sound that was not quite a laugh. Low, brief, surprised, like a man who had forgotten he was capable of making it. She walked back toward the kitchens with her heart doing something complicated in her chest and her boots crunching over the frost. She had been back in the kitchen for less than an hour, her hands in flour again, when Nell looked up from the fire and said, without preamble, "Colt Renner was at the east gate this morning." Josie's hands stilled. "Not at dawn," Nell said carefully. "Earlier, watching the path." The dough under Josie's hands went very cold. "He saw you," Nell said. Josie stood in the warm kitchen with the smell of wood smoke around her, and understood. With the slow certainty of someone who has lived long enough to recognize the shape of trouble before it fully arrives, that whatever had begun at the east gate was not going to be allowed to simply continue. Someone was already moving to stop it, and she did not yet know how far they would go. The hall that evening was different, not in any way that could be easily named. The same torches burned in the same iron brackets. The same rushes covered the same stone floor. The same smell of roasted meat and candle tallow filled the air. But the arrangement of people had shifted in the invisible, precise way that arrangements shift when someone powerful has made a decision, and everyone else is still calculating what it means. Josie stood at the entrance to the hall in her better dress. The dark blue wool, the one she had mended twice at the sleeve. The one she kept folded at the bottom of her small chest, because there had been very little occasion to wear it. Nell had found her a clean linen collar and pinned her hair up with 2 bone pins in a style that was simple and neat, and made her look, Nell had said with characteristic economy, like herself, properly. She had nearly not come. She had stood outside this same entrance 2 hours ago, turned around, walked back to the kitchens, and then stood in front of the cold hearth for 10 minutes before walking back. She was here because she had decided, somewhere between the flour and the cold hearth and the memory of 7 words on parchment, that she was tired of making herself smaller to fit into spaces that had been deliberately kept narrow. She was here because a man had stood at the east gate in the gray dawn and used her own words back at her without flinching. She was here, and she was afraid, and she was coming in anyway. The great hall noticed her arrival before she had taken 3 steps inside. It was not a loud noticing. It was the subtle collective shift of eyes. The way a room adjusts its attention when something unexpected enters it. She saw Colt Renner's gaze snap to her from across the hall, sharp and calculating. She saw Piers beside him, the broad man who had called her nothing in the corridor, and watched his expression move from surprise to something harder. She saw Lord Aldrich at the high table look up from his conversation and go very still. She kept walking, eyes forward, chin level. Her hands were cold, but she held them still at her sides. Cressida Fenn was positioned at the high table's right side, exactly where she had been the night before, her pale hair gleaming in the torchlight, her green gown replaced tonight with deep red samite that caught every flame in the room. She saw Josie. Something crossed her face, not the open contempt of cruelty, but the colder expression of someone doing a calculation and not liking the result. And at the head of the table, Adrian Voss looked up from a low conversation with his captain. He saw her. He did not react with surprise. He had expected her. The slight shift in his posture, an almost imperceptible straightening, the way a man orients himself toward something, was enough. His captain, the lean, sharp-eyed man with the braid at his shoulder, whose name she had since learned was Soren, followed his king's gaze to Josie and said nothing, but his expression became very carefully neutral in the way of someone who has many thoughts and is choosing not to voice them. A servant appeared at Josie's side, confused, uncertain what role she occupied tonight, guest or staff. She told him quietly that she was fine and moved toward the end of the lower table, where she sat down with her back straight and her hands folded and her heart hammering in a way she refused to let reach her face. Lord Aldrich left the high table within minutes. He was a tall man, Aldrich Fenn, with a lord's confidence and a lord's practiced warmth that never quite reached the calculation behind his eyes. He was not unkind. She had never found him cruel exactly. But he was a man who arranged things, who moved people like pieces on a strategy board with the cheerful efficiency of someone who had never considered that the pieces might have preferences. He crouched beside her table, a deliberate gesture, keeping his voice low, performing intimacy while ensuring no scene. "Josie," he said pleasantly. "What a surprise." "My lord," she said, "I was not aware you had been extended an invitation to dine as a guest this evening." "I was extended one this afternoon, my lord." His smile held. His eyes did not. "By whom?" She looked at him steadily. "I believe you know the answer to that." A brief silence. Something tightened in the pleasant expression. Not anger. Exactly, but the tension of a man who has planned a careful structure and found an unexpected weight placed upon it. "You understand," he said quietly, "that there are arrangements being considered. Matters of alliance and standing that require delicacy. His Majesty is a guest of this settlement, and he has certain responsibilities that go beyond—" He paused, selected his words. "Beyond personal curiosity." Personal curiosity. The diminishment of it was so smooth she almost missed it. "I understand my place very well, my lord," she said. "I always have." He patted the table near her hand, not touching her, just near, a lord's gesture of gentle conclusion. "Splendid," he said, and returned to the high table. Josie sat. She breathed. She did not leave. It was Soren who came to her next, which surprised her. He appeared at the edge of her table perhaps an hour into the meal, carrying 2 cups of wine and setting one in front of her without asking, then settling onto the bench across from her with the easy manner of a man who has never wasted time on ceremony he didn't mean. She looked at him cautiously. "Captain Soren," she said. "Just Soren," he said. He had a lean face with a scar that ran from his left eyebrow to his cheekbone, and eyes that were the gray of river stone and moved with a similar quality, constant, fluid, taking everything in. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at terrain before a march, assessing, precise, not unkind. "You're wondering why I'm here," he said. "Yes." "Because Lord Aldrich just sent Colt Renner to do something, and I'd like to know what, and that requires me to be over here where I can watch the room." He said it matter-of-factly, lifting his cup. "Also because you look like someone who could use a person to talk to who isn't calculating something about you." Josie looked at him for a moment. "Are you not calculating something about me?" "I'm calculating several things," he said honestly. "But they're all tactical, not political. There's a difference." She almost smiled. She picked up the wine. It was better wine than she had ever been given in this hall. "What do you make of this?" she said carefully. Not a full question. He would understand what she meant. He was quiet for a moment, watching the room. Across the hall, she could see Colt Renner moving toward a side door, unhurried, but with purpose. "I've ridden with Adrian Voss for 9 years," Soren said finally. "I've watched him in battle, and in council, and in every kind of difficult room there is. I have never seen him send a private note sealed with his personal wax to anyone he met in a corridor." He paused. Not once, not even close. Josie said nothing. "I'm not telling you what to do with that," he said. "I'm just telling you it's not nothing." He glanced at her sideways. "Whatever Aldrich's guard told you otherwise." The accuracy of it was startling. She looked at him sharply. He returned to watching the room with the expression of a man who has said what he came to say. Across the hall, Colt Renner slipped through the side door and disappeared. She found out what Colt Renner had done before the meal was finished. A young servant girl, barely 16, with wide eyes and a trembling mouth, appeared at Josie's side and pressed a folded scrap of cloth into her hand. When Josie unfolded it, she found a single line written in rough, unpracticed letters. "They found your brother's debt. Aldrich will use it." Josie went cold from her hands inward. Her brother Eden, 7 years older, long gone from Dunver, somewhere in the eastern settlements. A gambling debt, old and quiet, the kind of thing that had been safely buried for years under distance and silence. She had thought it forgotten. She had thought, perhaps, no one had ever known. Someone had known, and they had kept it like a stone in a closed fist, waiting for the right moment to throw it. She folded the scrap of cloth into her palm and kept her face entirely still while the torches burned and the hall moved around her, and understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water, that she was not simply an inconvenience to be managed. She was a threat to be removed. And the man who had called her nothing was holding the stone. And the man who had asked what she wanted was at the far end of the room with no knowledge of what was already moving toward them both. She had until morning to decide what to do, possibly less. She did not sleep. She sat on her pallet in the dark of the kitchen stores with the scrap of cloth folded in her hand and thought about Eden. About the last time she had seen him, 11 years ago, when he was 20 and she was 12, and he had ruffled her hair in the yard and told her he would send word when he was settled. Word had come twice, then once, then not at all. She had learned, through the slow, unreliable channels of settlement gossip, that he had fallen into debt somewhere east of the Greywood. She had sent what she could, a few copper coins saved from small errands, sewn into the lining of a message pouch. It had never been enough. She had always known it had never been enough. And now Lord Aldrich had it. Whatever Colt Renner had found, a record, a name, a promissory document passed through enough hands to end up in the wrong ones, Aldrich had it. And he would use it the way careful men use things. Quietly, precisely, at the moment of maximum effect. She could leave. That was the first thought, the one that came before courage or calculation. She could be gone before dawn, out the east gate and down the Frost Road, and none of this would matter because she would not be here to matter too. She had thought that before. 3 times after 3 bonding ceremonies. Each time, she had stayed. Not from hope. Hope had been too expensive by then. But from the particular stubbornness of someone who has no good options and refuses to let that be the last word about them. She thought of Adrian Voss at the East Gate in the gray morning. Specifically, on purpose. She put the scrap of cloth in the small chest under her pallet, rose, and pulled on her boots. The castle was not fully asleep. It never was, with the King's Garden residence. There were men at every outer door, and 2 at the entrance to the east wing, and she knew them by their rotations the way she knew every corner of Dunver, by long, unnoticed observation. She did not go to the east wing. She went to Nell. Nell's room was a small space off the herb store, barely large enough for a cot and a chest, smelling permanently of dried lavender and something bitter she used for her joints in winter. Nell opened the door before Josie knocked, which was either the intuition of a woman who had known her for 20 years or the sleeplessness of old age. Probably both. Josie told her everything, quickly, quietly, with her hands still and her voice low. The note. Eden's debt. Renner and Piers and Aldrich's careful, pleasant face as he crouched beside her table and wrapped a threat in the language of consideration. Nell listened without interrupting. Her white braid lay over one shoulder. Her hands, stained and capable, rested in her lap. When Josie finished, she was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do?" Nell asked. The same question, a different voice. "I want to tell him," Josie said. Before Aldrich does. Before it becomes a weapon aimed at both of us. Nell looked at her carefully. That's brave. It's practical, Josie said. If he hears it from Aldrich first, it looks like I was hiding it. If he hears it from me, it looks like you trust him, Nell said. Josie held the old woman's gaze. Maybe I do, she said. A little. Enough. Nell stood, went to her small chest, and produced a folded square of parchment, the kind used for proper correspondence, not servants' errands. She set it on the cot beside Josie. His steward came by this afternoon, she said. While you were in the hall. Left this. Said it was only to be given to you directly. She paused. I was waiting to see if you'd need it. Josie picked it up. The same black wax seal. The same plain, direct hand. If something moves against you before morning, go to the east wing. Tell the guard, Silver Pine. They will let you through. She read it twice. Then she looked up at Nell. He knew, she said quietly. He already knew Aldrich would move. Kings don't arrive at positions of power by being surprised, Nell said, not unkindly. He's been watching this settlement since he rode through the gate. He's been watching Aldrich. And he's been watching what Aldrich does with inconvenient things. She touched Josie's hand briefly, the closest Nell ever came to tenderness. Go, before it's light. The guard at the East Wing entrance was a tall man with a steady face and the careful blankness of someone trained to reveal nothing. When Josie approached, he moved fractionally, the way guards move when they are deciding. She said, Silver Pine. He stepped aside without a word. The East Wing at night was a different world from the rest of Dunvar. Quieter, better maintained, the torches in better brackets that didn't smoke. The stone floor swept clean. She followed the corridor to the door at its end, which was heavy oak banded with iron, and knocked 3 times as something in her chest decided this was the moment it would choose to be afraid. The door opened. Adrian Voss was awake and dressed, which meant either he had not slept or he had risen already. He wore a plain dark tunic, no cloak, his dark hair slightly disordered in a way that made him look, for one unguarded moment, like someone who existed outside of his own authority. There was a fire in the room behind him, and the smell of pine resin from the wood burning in it. A table near the fire held an open map and 2 unlit candles. He looked at her face and stepped back from the door. She came in. He closed it behind her. Sit, he said, not commanding, offering. She sat in the chair nearest the fire because her hands were cold, and her legs were less steady than she would have liked. He moved to stand near the table, giving her space, leaning against it with his arms crossed, not closed off, but contained, the posture of a man who has learned to take up only the room he needs. Tell me, he said. So she told him. About Eden, about the debt, about Colt Renner moving through the side door, and the note pressed into her hand by a frightened serving girl. She told it plainly, without apology or softening, because she had decided on the walk through the corridor that she was done making herself easier to dismiss by making herself easier to pity. He listened the same way he had at the East Gate, fully, without interrupting, without the small, impatient adjustments of a man waiting for his turn to speak. When she finished, the fire crackled in the silence between them. Your brother's debt, he said. What is the amount? She told him. It was not a small sum. 3 years of her kitchen wages would not have covered it. He nodded once. I'll have it cleared by morning. Josie stared at him. That's not why I came here. I know, he said. That's why I'm doing it. She felt the back of her eyes sting again and pushed it down firmly. You can't simply... It's not your responsibility. Eden's choices were not... Aldrich is using your brother's mistake as a stone to throw at you because you walked into his hall tonight as a guest instead of a servant, Adrian said. His voice was even, but something underneath it was not. That is not your fault, and I will not allow it to be used against you. It will look like you're protecting an Omega serving girl from a lord of your own kingdom, she said. That will have consequences. Yes, he said. Aldrich will pull his support from your northern supply arrangement. He was already looking for reasons to renegotiate it. This changes nothing strategically. He paused. And if it did, it would still not change what I'm about to do. Josie looked at him across the firelit room. The pine smoke moved between them. Outside, the last of the night was beginning to soften toward the gray that preceded dawn. She could feel it in the quality of the silence, the particular stillness that came just before the world restarted. Why? She said. The same question she had asked at the gate. She meant it differently now. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the fire rather than at her, and she understood that what came next was costing him something, that men who have been kings long enough sometimes lose the habit of honesty about things that matter to them. I have spent 9 years making decisions for an entire kingdom, he said. Every decision I make touches thousands of people. I have learned to be careful, measured, to choose what is sustainable over what is right when I cannot have both. He paused. I have become very good at that. And in becoming good at it, I have occasionally made peace with things I should not have made peace with. He looked at her then. You walked into that hall tonight in a mended dress with your hair pinned up, and you sat at the end of the lower table, and you did not leave when Aldrich came and smiled at you, like a threat wrapped in courtesy. Something moved in his expression. Something open and unguarded and real. I have sat in councils with lords 3 times your age, who could not do what you did tonight. And I am not going to stand aside while a man with a gambling record and a political agenda uses your brother's misfortune to send you back to the kitchens. The fire popped. A log settled. Josie sat with her hands in her lap and felt something inside her, something she had kept very tightly held for a very long time, begin, carefully, to come loose. I am not a strategic choice, she said. Her voice was steady. I want you to be certain of that before anything else. I am not noble born. I have no family standing, no alliance to offer, no political value to this settlement or any other. 3 men have looked at me in bonding circles and found nothing worth choosing. I am Josie, he said quietly. She stopped. I know what you are, he said. I've known since the corridor. You are the person who carried that jug like it weighed more than it should, and looked up at me like someone who had long since stopped expecting anything from the world and had decided to manage anyway. He paused. I recognized it, because I have been managing for 9 years, and I had forgotten that managing is not the same as living. The silence that followed was the kind that does not need to be filled. Morning broke sharp and clear over Dunvere. The kind of autumn morning that is beautiful and cold, and does not apologize for either. Lord Aldrich Fenn arrived at the Great Hall for the morning council to find that 3 things had already happened without him. First, a sealed document bearing the AlphaKing sigil had been delivered before dawn to the settlement's record keeper, formally discharging a debt held in the name of one Eden of Dunvere Eastern Settlements. The debt was cleared in full, paid from the king's own traveling treasury. No explanation was offered. None was required. Second, Captain Soren had quietly and thoroughly interviewed Colt Renner and Piers about the note passed to a servant girl the previous evening. The interview had been polite, brief, and resulted in both men being relieved of their positions near the king's person for the duration of the visit. Soren had delivered this information to Renner with the pleasant directness of a man removing a splinter, efficiently, without drama, without cruelty, but completely. Third, when the morning council convened in the Great Hall's upper chamber, there was a chair at the table that had not been there the previous day. It was not positioned at the end, where servants sometimes sat to record proceedings. It was at the table. A chair with arms, beside the king's captain, with a cup of water already placed before it. Lord Aldrich looked at this chair for a long moment. Josie was already sitting in it. She wore the dark blue wool dress again. She had not had time to find another. Her hair was pinned with the same bone pins. She met Lord Aldrich's gaze with the steady, careful expression of someone who had made a decision and intended to remain in it. Aldrich looked from Josie to Adrian Voss, who was reviewing the morning's correspondence at the head of the table with the focused calm of a man who has already resolved every question in the room and is simply waiting for the others to catch up. "Your Majesty," Aldrich said. His pleasant voice had developed a careful quality. "I was not aware. I require a secondary note-keeper for this morning's council," Adrian said without looking up. "Your settlements records indicate Josie has served as ledger assistant to your grain stores. She can read and write and keep an accurate account. That is what I need." He turned a page. "Please sit down, my lord." It was not, of course, about note-keeping. Everyone in the room knew it was not about note-keeping. But the shape of it was unassailable. A king requesting a practical service from an available member of a settlement was well within the ordinary business of a royal visit, and there was nothing Aldrich could point to that was improper, and Adrian Voss had constructed it with the elegant precision of a man who has been playing this kind of game longer than Aldrich had been a lord. Aldrich sat down. Across the table, Soren caught Josie's eye and said nothing. His expression was the careful neutral she was beginning to understand meant something approaching approval. The council proceeded. Josie took notes. Her hand was steady. Her writing was small and clear. She did not interject. She did not need to. She was in the room, which was the point. Present, specific, undeniable, occupying a chair that had been placed for her by someone who did not require her to be anything other than what she was. Cressida Fenn did not appear at the council. Josie did not think less of her for it. Cressida was a girl who had been positioned by her father, not by her own choosing, in a situation that had simply changed around her. That was its own kind of difficulty. By the time the council concluded and the morning light had climbed fully up the hall's stone walls, Lord Aldrich had agreed, with the stiff dignity of a man who has lost a negotiation he did not know he was in, to the supply route arrangement Adrian's men had drafted, with terms somewhat less favorable to Dunver than originally offered. Not punitive, just accurate. It was Soren who explained to Josie later, walking beside her through the outer yard while the horses were being readied for the king's party, what had actually happened in the language underneath the council's formal proceedings. "Aldrich overplayed," Soren said simply. "He thought he had time. He thought the king's interest in you was a passing thing he could manage with one careful night and a well-timed piece of information." He glanced at her. He didn't understand what he was actually looking at. "What was he looking at?" Josie asked. Soren was quiet for a step or two. "A king who has been alone for 9 years," he said. "And who, apparently, has finally found someone he doesn't have to perform anything for." The king's party rode out of Dunver at midday. Josie stood in the outer yard and watched them prepare, the horses stamping in the cold, breath streaming, the black cloaks snapping in a wind that had come down from the north since morning, carrying the first real promise of winter. The silver wolf sigils caught the pale light. The guards moved with the practiced efficiency of people who had packed and mounted and ridden out of places many times. She had said nothing to Adrian since the council. There had been no moment. Or rather, there had been many moments, but all of them had been surrounded by other people, and what she needed to say to him was not a thing for other people's proximity. He came to her before he mounted. He walked from the direction of the stables, adjusting a riding glove, and stopped in front of her in the yard with the wind moving his dark cloak, and his expression holding that particular quality she had come to recognize over these 3 days. The careful openness of a man who does not do this often,